morning, Dallas. So I'm a writer. It's one of the things I love to do, which means I'm a storyteller. And so I would love to tell y'all a little story, if that's cool. Is that good? All right. So I want you to imagine being in the 4th, 5th grade. Oh, is that Obama? See, Obama like calling in like, yo, you got it? You good? You situated? Okay. Tell Obama I hit him up when we get done. It's all good. So imagine you're in the 4th or 5th grade. And you got this test. And you're super excited, but you're also nervous. Go to school, ace the test. On your way home, all you can think about is that moment when you share the test results with your parent. And so you running down the street. I was a little bit faster than that back then. I wasn't as fly though. And you get home, and you walk into the house, and you're like, Ma, check out my test. That was me, 4th grade, running in the house to share the test results with my mother. Instead of embracing me with the love and nourishment that children need to get through life, my mother turned and threw a pot at me with such force that it broke the tiles on the wall behind me. That's what it was like growing up in our household. On the outside looking in, we had the model for black middle-class America. My father was in the Air Force, worked for the state, and my mother was a primary homemaker. But what was happening on the inside of our home, which happens a lot in households throughout the nation, is that my mother was extremely abusive. It wasn't until years later that we recognized that she may have been suffering from some form of mental illness, because we think it takes a mentally ill person to beat, degrade, dehumanize their children. By the time I was 14 years old, I decided that I had had enough of that treatment and that I didn't want to live in a household where I didn't feel safe or welcome. And so I decided to run away. Now, like many teenagers, when I ran away, I was extremely naive. I thought that somebody would say, here's this smart, lovable, handsome kid. I was handsome then. And that they would take me in, and that they would nurture me, and that they would care for me. And tragically and unfortunately, that's not the reality of the world that we live in. And so for the next 2 weeks, I found myself sleeping in garages, in basements, my friends sneaking me food, hustling from the local store. And after 2 weeks, I realized that I was homeless, and that I had nowhere to go. And it's that level of vulnerability that older, more seasoned street hustlers prey on. So when you see the young men and women out there in the community, you understand how they get manipulated into these situations. This is their story, and their story is my story. And so at 14 years old, I found myself deeply immersed in the crack cocaine trade. This is when crack first came to inner city in the Midwest. We had no idea how devastating this drug would be. But it didn't take nothing for 6 months for me to find out. In the first 6 months, my childhood friend was murdered. He was shot to death in front of a crack house at the age of 15. My older brother got shot in the neck and was temporarily paralyzed. My other brother ended up getting shot. And so this was the culture that I was in at 14 years old. Within 6 months, I found myself addicted to crack cocaine, which is said to be one of the most highly addictive drugs known to man. I was robbed at gunpoint, and I was beat nearly to death. And I remember when I got beat, I remember laying on the bathroom floor. It's cold, dingy, nasty, trifling bathroom floor of a crack house. And I remember asking myself this question: who would allow their child to live this type of existence? And sadly, the reality is a lot of people. And so despite those hardships and those adversities, I continued on in the culture. I was fortunate enough to be able to break the addiction on my own. And the craziest thing about breaking the addiction, it was for the most superficial reasons you can imagine. It wasn't because I had like some profound epiphany like, yo, I shouldn't be smoking crack. It was like, you know what? I'm spending more money on crack than I am on fly apparel, and I'm really not feeling this, right? So it was a trade-off. But I found myself back in that culture, and I continued to sell drugs for the next few years. And then at the age of 17, March 8th, 1990, woke up. I had like a slight hangover, which I shouldn't have had at 17, but don't judge me. And I remember getting up and saying, yo, I need to just kind of walk this off. And I walked outside, and my partner was pulling up. We stood outside, and we talked for a minute. And we walked down to the corner where we was just casually talking. And a car rolled up. And me and the driver exchanged eye contact. And then we exchanged words. And then in old school customary fashion, I invited him out the car for an old school scrap. This is what we did. I'm from the hood, I'm from Detroit, that's what we do. You fight, you live to see another day. But this was when the community began to change. And this is when we went from a neighborhood to a hood. And so instead of him getting out the car, he turned around and fired multiple shots, hitting me 3 times. I will never forget what it felt like the first time a bullet entered my body. I will never forget the fear that I felt as I ran, and I hoped that he didn't shoot me in the back of my head or in my spine as I sought safety. And so I ran around the corner. One of my other friends came out with a gun and escorted me back. And I remember sitting on the porch bleeding, and my friend trying to calm me down, who had just got shot the year prior. So he knew all the ailments and all the things I was going to experience because he had already experienced them. And so as he's calming me down and we waiting on the ambulance, which never came, I just remember thinking to myself, like, this pattern is so persistent in our lives. He ended up taking me to the hospital and dropped me off, and he kept it moving because he didn't want to be questioned. And I remember sitting in the hospital, and the police coming in, and they said, who shot you? And I was like, I don't know. And instead of asking me how I felt, what I was thinking, what I was processing, the officer was like, this is what's wrong with y'all little niggas. And this is why you send your ass in the hospital right now, because when something happens, you don't want to speak up. You don't want to speak out. And I was like, well, thank you, officer. This is a great way to enter the hospital. But it was a systematic reality of what happens in inner city America. So the doctors came in, they pulled the bullets out, they patched me up, and within a couple of days, I was right back on the same block. Not one adult, not one professional, not one counselor, psychologist, therapist thought to say, hey, how do you feel? That shouldn't have happened to you. That's not normal behavior. Do you need a hug? And so what I carried back to my block was this volatile cocktail of emotions. I was angry, I was bitter, I was distrustful, I was paranoid, I was afraid. And I remember this narrative that I began to tell myself, because stories matter. See, the things that we tell ourselves become our reality. And we talk those things to existence. So I remember telling myself that I'm not going to allow anybody else to shoot me. And that went from, I'm not going to allow anybody else to shoot me, that if I find myself in a conflict, I'm going to shoot first. And so that became a dominant narrative as I began to carry a gun with me every day. I don't care what I was doing. If I was eating breakfast, I had a gun right there on the table. If I was in the bathroom, I had a gun right there on the sink. If I was asleep or doing other things in beds, it was a gun somewhere nearby. Because that was my reality. No matter where I went, I felt like I had to carry a gun with me. And the more I carried, the more I told myself that story that if I found myself in conflict, I would shoot first. In a 14-month time span, from March 8th, 1990 to July 28th, 1991, I found myself in 4 different conflicts. And I shot first in every one of them. And tragically, July 1991, at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, got into an argument over a drug transaction that I refused to make. The argument escalated relatively quickly, and I remember putting my hand on the pistol. And we continued to argue. And I had this moment where I was like, I should just go in. And so I turned to go in when I heard a movement like a car door opening. And in that moment, what flashed through my mind was the multiple feelings that I felt when I got shot. And I turned and I fired what turned out to be 4 fatal shots, tragically ending a man's life. I was subsequently arrested, charged with open murder, and eventually sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison for second-degree murder. When I stood in front of the judge, I was 19 years old. At 19, you can barely see 2 weeks down the line, let alone 2 decades down the line. So I thought my life was over. I thought everything that I can possibly imagine a future to be would no longer exist. And so when I went to prison, I was bitter, I was angry, I was emotionally confused, and I found myself getting in more and more trouble. My first 5 years in prison, I accumulated 25 misconducts that ranged from everything from dangerous contraband to assault on officer, assault on inmate, substance abuse. They sent me to maximum security my first year in prison. I was the youngest guy at maximum security. I turned 20 in maximum security, 23-hour lockdown prison. They wouldn't allow me to get a job in there. They wouldn't allow me to go to school because the warden said, you are one of the absolute worst of the worst. But in the midst of that turmoil and that darkness and that anger and that bitterness, I was blessed with some of the most courageous, thoughtful, articulate, intelligent mentors that I will ever have in my life. These are men that are serving life in prison. Some of them are dying in prison right now. That saw something in me in the midst of my darkest moments that I didn't see in myself. And they would say to me, come here, young blood. Like, you smart, man. You got a second chance. I'm like, man, I don't want to hear nothing about no second chance. Man, I got 2 decades. I ain't thinking about no second chance. I'm going to die in here. They're like, you're not going to die in here, man. It only feel like you're going to die in here. See, me, I'm going to die in here. I got life with no parole. I don't have a chance of ever getting out of here. I know I'm going to die in here. You're not going to die in here unless you get killed in here. You got a second chance, do something with your life. Man, get out of here, old head. I don't want to hear that. I'm thugging it out on the yard. I got money to make out here. I got decisions to make, but it was something about those conversations that always led me back to him. And so I would talk to him, and we would argue, and we would debate, and I was still thugging it out on the yard. And they started giving me books. Read this. What you think about that? See, that's how they tricked me to read, asking me what I thought about something that they gave me. See, they didn't just give me a book and read and be like, go read that, and then read this one. Like, man, I just read this book, man, and this, I was kind of thinking about this. Man, I wonder what you think. What would you think about this? Here, read that. And I remember the first time I got Malcolm X's autobiography and how it exploded every idea I thought about myself and how it challenged me in ways that nothing had before and how I saw myself in his story because of our similar experiences. And so Malcolm became kind of like, any of y'all grew up watching cartoons? Yeah. I know, Mike. Mike. So you remember the cartoons when we used to have a little angel on one shoulder and a little devil on one shoulder? So that's how Malcolm became like that angel for me, right? And my old street self was that little devil. And so when I was in prison doing what I was doing, I ran literally every illegal market you could think of in prison. I loan shark, I sold drugs, I ordered hits. I literally ran a prison system. But every time I was about to make a decision, Malcolm would pop up. Like, hey, brother, you know that's not the right thing to do. And I'd be like, go on now, Malcolm. Got this bit to do. I got time to do up in here, And so the discovery of Malcolm wouldn't allow me to push away what I knew to be the right thing. So I battled. I went back and forth. I battled. It was a long, drawn-out battle. But the thing about Malcolm that really inspired me more than anything was his intellectual curiosity. See, when we hear Malcolm's story, the first thing we hear is black nationalist, human rights, civil rights advocate, pro-armed revolution. We hear all these things. Rarely do we hear about the profound intellectual that he was, a self-taught intellectual at that, a person who studied night in, night out, no matter what, read the dictionary from A to Z, and then from Z to A, and then everywhere in between, and became one of the most articulate, intelligent black men that the world has ever known. Self-taught. He didn't have to go through Harvard, Yale, and none of those other universities that we tend to use to validate our intelligence. He just showed up. And so that challenged me to start reading other things. I began to read philosophy and psychology and political science and world history and black history and African history, which are two different things because they manifest in two different spaces, even though they all generate from the same source. And I began to think different. And I began to wake up inside, but in spite of that, I still had time to do. And there are things that occur in that environment that demand a different response that most people in civilized society won't understand. So 8 years into my incarceration, I found myself in solitary confinement for what turned out to be 4.5 years straight in a cell that's not as big as this stage right here. For 4.5 years straight, 23-hour lockdown in the most hellish, barbaric environment you can imagine. And I remember I would walk around that little cell, just like this. Every day, that was my exercise. And I would walk and I would think, and I would ask myself these tough questions. How did I go from being an honor roll scholarship student with dreams of being a doctor to serving out my most promising years in the most barbaric space you can imagine in American society? And the constant asking those questions wouldn't allow me to rest in the insanity that the environment is designed to produce. Like there's no other reason in the environment other than to break and shatter your humanity that solitary confinement exists. They say within 30 days, most humans begin to lose some of their mental faculties. In 90 days, you're basically deemed crazy. And for 4.5 years straight, I existed in that insane environment. And so I found myself in solitary confinement at a point in my life where I was actually finding myself. And so in the midst of this moment happened. And it was one of the most profound moments in my life. Now, when you're incarcerated, mail means everything. I don't know how many of y'all have done some time. Mike, I know you got a little something on your feelings back there. But mail call is like the quietest time of day in prison. Because everybody's sitting with the emotional anticipation of hoping that somebody on the outside just send them a note and say, you know what? I thought about you today. I care about you today. I'm here to support you. And so I don't care how tough you are. I don't care how savvy you are. Mail call is the reality check for life in prison because everybody's vulnerable. And one or two things happen. Either you act like you really don't care. I don't care about no mail. I don't care if nobody come through. It's a defense mechanism that you learn to use to block out the pain of when nobody shows up in your life when you need them most. And so I had the last cell on the tier. That was kind of like the privileged cell because I ran the yard, so they like we put them in the best cell possible in solitary, if that makes any sense. It's the best cell. You got the penthouse in solitary. And there was like a little crack that I could see down the tier, just enough to see when the officers was coming and to get a glimpse of like one of my neighbors if they got out so I can at least know who I'm talking to up under the door. But it was literally a small sliver, and I could see. And so on mail call, I would watch the officer go from cell to cell. And he had that stack of mail, and it would get smaller and smaller the closer he got to my cell. And I would always think to myself, like, man, I hope by the time he get here, he still has a couple of letters. And so on this particular day, I hit what's considered the lotto of mail call. I got multiple letters. I got letters from friends and other joints. Got a letter from my father, who was my biggest supporter while I was in prison. And I got a letter from my son. And so I read to see what was happening in the lives of my friends and other joints, read their letters. And I read my father's letter. And I saved my son's letter for last. And typically it was the other way around. Usually I would read my son's letter because he was just writing about school or whatever. And then I would read my father's letters because he would always, me and him would debate stuff and talk about different things. But when I opened my son's letter, I realized immediately there was something different about this letter than any other letter he ever sent me. Because in the right-hand corner, in big, bold letters, he wrote, "Dear Dad, my mom told me why you're in prison. For murder." He said, "Dad, don't kill again. Jesus watches what you do." Hearing those words from my son, who was 10 at the time, shattered every aspect of hood savvy, street toughness, prison yard rule. And it challenged me in a way that I never thought anything would challenge me before. Because in that moment, what I realized is that I didn't owe my son an explanation. I owe him a father. And in order to be the father that he needed, I had to change things in my life to honor my responsibility as his father. And so I started to ask those tougher questions of what made you make that decision that night. And I began to write, and I went backwards and I started writing. And I started writing about the moments where I saw the change in myself. See, when I first hit the streets, I was a naive, green kid. I'm like giving crack away. You know, I'm all nice and generous. Oh yeah, just, you can come pay me 3 weeks from now. You know, naive as can be. But shortly, the streets started chipping away at that. They started chipping away at my humanity, at my softness, at my generosity. And I became hardened. And then I got to prison in this very racially tense environment, this barbaric environment, this new age of slavery. When I say slavery, I mean it in every sense of the word. Anytime that you can force a human to do demanding labor for 17 cents an hour, That's slavery. Our Constitution justifies it. The 13th Amendment, if you've never read it, I call it the P. Diddy of amendments because it remixed slavery. It just made it cuter and more sophisticated, and we fell for it. And most of us haven't even read it. I'm going to tell you what it said, the 13th Amendment. Slavery shall be abolished except for those who have been duly convicted of a crime. Prisons are plantations. Let's just be clear about it. Prisons are plantations. It's cheap labor. Some of the companies you use right now today are exploiting cheap and free labor. There's no coincidence why our prison system is one of the largest in the world. We make up 5% of the world population, but we have 25% of the prison population. And 25% of that prison population, 50 to 60% of that is black, African, Latino, young inner city kids who made poor decisions, and sometimes who didn't make poor decisions at all, who end up in that space. So it's in that environment that I began to think about, what do I want my life outcomes to be? So as I journal, and I encourage everybody in here to journal. It's one of the most powerful tools you have at your disposal to write out and look at your thoughts, to figure out where you're trying to go in life, where you've been, what you've been through. And you don't have to share it with anybody, but share it with yourself. And so as I began to journal, I began to go backwards, I began to identify things. And I realized the difference between disciplining the child and abusing the child. And I was able to finally label what happened to me abuse. I was able to finally step up and say, you know what, my mother was wrong. And that I shouldn't have had to bear the burden of her issues. Like, no child deserves that. And it's one of the hardest things, when you grew up in a black community, one of the hardest things to say, you know what, my mother's abusive. Because we hold mothers in such high esteem, as we should, when they're being mothers. But we don't talk about those issues that impact such a large segment of our society. Those kids that you see standing on the street corner, those kids that you see hanging out at the liquor store and the gas station, they're running from something. And you have to ask them, what are you running from? See, we're very quick to judge without really stepping back and saying, what would make a child prefer the discomfort of living homeless and not knowing where their meal coming from over a house with a warm bed? Children don't run without reason. And what happens is when they run from something, they often run into things that's a little bit harder than they could have ever imagined. And so going back and journaling allowed me to do those things. And so after I got through that process, I realized that I had to be very intentional about what I wanted my life outcomes to be. And so I started writing down goals. And in the midst of writing down those goals, I realized that I had never accomplished anything in my life. Well, I got a GED, but that ain't really count. But I had never accomplished anything. There was no prom. There was no high school graduation. There was no childhood sweetheart. All the nuanced things that characterize your life in the world, I had accomplished none of those things. So I challenged myself. I said, listen, I said, if you're serious about turning your life around, write a book. But don't just write a book in 30 days. Now, I don't know how many of y'all in here are writers or had to write a dissertation or a report. That's a little bit of pressure. A book in 30 days. I ain't talking about like a coffee table book where you just write big words and use some graphics and be like, I got this book out. I'm talking about a serious book. And so I sat down and I began to write. And there was no laptops, no smart phones, no iPads, none of that stuff. Old school. Y'all young folks, they used to have this stuff called pen and pad. That's how we used to get on back in the day. That's how I used to get numbers from the girls, like, yo, write your number down. Holler at you, shorty. So in solitaire, you don't even get a regular pen, though. they give you like this little flimsy pen because they don't want you like sticking the guards through the food slot. And so I took that pen and I rolled that pen up. And I'm quite sure Mike know what I'm talking about. According to them stories you was trying to avoid. Y'all done did a little rolling up in your time. But I rolled this pen up and I began to write. And I would literally write from the time the lights came on in the morning to the time they shut the lights off. I would take breaks in between, read a little bit, work out. But I wrote. And then when they turned the lights out, I would go stand by the little cell window I had. And whatever little light came in there, I just wrote. And in 30 days, that book was done. And I had that Toyota moment. Remember them old school commercials? They'd be like, oh, what a feeling. You jump up and kick your feet. I had that Toyota feeling because for the first time in my life, I felt like I had accomplished something. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. It's not a book until somebody else read it. So I said, well, let me send it to one of my neighbors on the tier with me. And so I made a fish line. And so the fish line is made out of an old toothpaste tube. You take all the toothpaste out of it, stuff it with some tissue, wet the tissue, let that dry. You take a pair of socks or your underwear, either one, whichever one I need them to draw, so I decided to use my socks. And I would unravel them, and then I would make the string, and I would tie it to that toothpaste tube, and then I could slide it across the tier. My neighbor can pull it in. So I tied the book up, he pulled it in. And so our fish line was kind of like our texting or email system. That's how we communicated. And I remember the funniest thing happened, right? As I was watching the book go up under my door, I had this moment where I was like, damn, that's my only copy. Like, it's my only copy. I'm like, I don't even really know this dude across the hall from me. I'm like, oh, this is gonna be all bad, right? So he get the book, and I don't hear nothing from this guy. Like literally, for like hours, I'm like, calling, like, yo, bro, this guy won't even respond to me. So I'm really like, oh, man, I gave this guy my only copy. I got to start all the way over. Start this 30 days over. I know I ain't going to be able to write the same story. But eventually he came back to the door. He threw his fish line over, and I pulled the book back in. And he was like, man, this is one of the best books I ever read. And I was like, man, I had like a super Toyota moment. As a writer, that's all you want to hear, right? And so I thought about it. See, I'm a real reflective person. So I stepped back from the emotions of being all excited. I was like, well, he is in solitary confinement. He probably over there bored as hell. Like, I could have sent him a recipe. He'd have been like, man, it's the best gravy ever. Like, you put onions in this? So I had to step back from like my ego a little bit and was like, okay, well, let me send this out. And so I remember I started sending my work out to my one brother. It's 5 boys in our family. I got one brother. He the only one that did it the traditional way that we call, right? He went to school and never got in trouble. And so I respected his opinion in a different way. And I sent it to him, and he was like, bro, listen, I done went to college, I done went to school, and I have not came across anybody that writes as well as you, et cetera, et cetera. So I started writing essays and articles, and I would just like randomly send them out to papers. I would look up who the editor and be like, well, I got something to say about this issue, and I would send it out. And people started responding. And I started getting published in college papers and local newspapers, and I ended up getting published by the people who did Chicken Soup for the Soul. They have a series where they work with men and women inside who write about inspirational things. So I'm like getting published all over the place. And so after I wrote that first book, I was like, okay, that's cool. You did it one time. That's all right. It's all right. You know, good accomplishment. But I'm like, to me, the mark of greatness is being able to do something over and over again. And so I challenged myself to write another book. And I challenged myself to do it in 30 days or less. And so I wrote that second book. And then I started on the third book. And I remember in the midst of writing the third book, I became the most depressed I had ever been inside prison. And I realized that the reason I was depressed was because I was in the worst place for a dream to be born. And so I remember sitting there like, man, my dream was born in a place where I'm not in a position to make it happen. And so I fell into this depression. I couldn't write. because I realized that I had to get out of solitary confinement. And the only thing that was playing out in my mind was the word that the warden told me is that you probably never getting out of solitary confinement. Because I had committed the ultimate sin that led me there. I had assaulted an officer very seriously. And they take that extremely seriously in prison. Like, it's the worst thing. Like, you can kill another person who's doing time in there, and you'll do less time in solitary confinement than you will for assaulting an officer. And I remember sitting there, and I said to myself, you know what? You've read all these books, you've meditated, you prayed, you thought, and you said this, you said you believe that what you think manifests. And I said, if you believe that, write the warden. Like, if you believe that you're worthy of getting out and moving on and doing something meaningful with your life, write the warden and express that to him. And so I remember sitting down and I wrote this letter. It's probably like one of the most articulate letters I've ever written in my life, because I was actually writing for my life. And the warden responded to me directly, which never happens. Usually a deputy warden, a secretary, somebody along those lines. The warden responded to me directly and said, your letter is so compelling that I'm going to give you an opportunity. And I'm going to advocate for you to get out of solitary confinement. And that's what he did. So he advocated for me to get out. They didn't let me out initially because he had to go through a higher up, and they was like, well, we don't trust what you're talking about, warden. Keeping him in a little bit longer. But after 4.5 years, I walked out of solitary confinement. And I remember telling guys, and they thought I was joking, right? So I told them, I say, listen, I said, if they ever let me out of solitary confinement, I'm a George Jefferson stroll out the cell block. And so they thought I was playing though, right? So the guy come to my door, he like, Shaka. He like, man, they just released you. He give me the bag, I'm packing my stuff, pack up, got my bag, they bust that door. I'm like, I was just free. And what I explained to them was, I wasn't doing that to mock the prison. I was just recognizing that I was moving on up into a newer self, and that the real tests were about to occur, and that I had to put the real work in, because now I'm back in solitary confinement. Out of solitary confinement, where I'm the man on the yard, and I got to make tough decisions now, and I got to explain to my team that, look, I'm trying to move in a different direction. And so that's when the real challenges began. And so I navigated my way through them. Wasn't always pretty, but it was necessary. And so I continued to write, but also taught myself how to run my own company. Because what I realized is this: you can wait for somebody else to make your dream happen, or you can step up to the place and make it happen yourself. And so I went and bought a book about self-publishing. I learned everything I could. I saved up the money that I had from people sending me money to working. I was working in the law library. I was making like $54 a month. It's like the most balling job you can have at the joint. Like, I'm literally doing the equivalent of like a paralegal work for like $54 a month. And so I would save that money. Whenever my father sent me money, I would save half of that. I still was hustling on the yard, just keeping it real. Took that money, had a partner out in society. We started a book company. I published my first book from prison in 2008. Right after I published that book, I got sued by the Michigan Department of Corrections for $1 million. They said they wanted me to pay for the cost of my incarceration, which they gave me an itemized list of how much it cost me to be incarcerated every day at every different prison I was at. And they was like, we want you to pay that tab. And so when I get the lawsuit, I was so offended, because I'm like, here it is. I know that if I'm ever released to society, nobody's going to give me an opportunity. So I created opportunity on my own, and so instead of applauding that and saying, wow, this is really smart of you to start your own business and do something meaningful with your life, they sued me. And so they sued me for 90% of any of the profits or proceeds from the book. And so first I was like super upset, and then I thought about it. I said, okay, this is beef. This is a new type of beef. Ain't a neighborhood beef, but now I got beef with the courts, and we got to beef this out, right? And so I stepped back from emotions and ego, and I was like, okay, well, what do you know? And I was like, well, I work in the law library, so I do know some things about the law. And contractual law is binding anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter if you're incarcerated or not. Contractual law is binding. So I was like, it's kind of smart. So what I did is I signed a contract to myself saying that I will only accept 10% of the proceeds of any book sold once the company recoups its production costs. And that protected the other 90%. And so they went from suing me from 90% of every book for $15 to suing me for 90% of 10% of that $15. And so when we went to court, the attorney was so mad though, right? This is like the funniest shit though. Oh, excuse me for the little kid. It's like funny though, right? Because like she was so mad, she was like, well, he can't do that. And the judge was like, well, technically he can, and he did. And so realistically, she like, you won a lawsuit, but he won a moral victory, also known as the smartest hell victory. And so that happened. And then like after that, right after that, so I'm like, okay, we got through this, published the first book. Now it's time to go up for parole. I go up to the parole hearing. The first hearing took about 60 minutes. The lady told me, I don't think you're prepared for society. Now at this time, I had not only published my first novel, also had published a children's book, had been published nationally, had every type of endorsement for freedom you can think about, from presidents of universities to community folks, et cetera, et cetera. But after 60 seconds, she determined I wasn't ready for society. Denied my parole, had to wait another year. 2009 come around. Second trip up for parole, I go in, parole agent, she's super cool, me and her, we talking. She flirting a little bit, I'm flirting back. I'm like, oh, I'm on my way out. She vote for me, second guy vote against me, goes to a third person. Third person never saw me. He sat with the other guy who never saw me. Denied my parole. So I told myself, I said, you know what, I'm not going through this no more. If I don't know how to do nothing else, I know how to do time. At that point, I had 18 years in, and I'm like, I know how to do time, and I'm not about to send my family on this emotional roller coaster only to get disappointed. And at the time, I was in a relationship with a beautiful, beautiful woman. And I'm like seriously beautiful, not like that typical story you hear, like the unattractive chick that end up going to prison finding a dude. No, she's like model, beautiful, PhD doctor, amazing woman. She came up on a visit, and I remember just watching her. I'm sitting there in the visiting room, and I'm watching her coming through, and I'm playing out the words of how I'm about to break up with this woman as she's walking through, because I'm tired of seeing her get searched and touched and prodded by the officers. And she walk in, and before she even got to my chair, I done broke down crying. I'm teared, I'm boo-hooing. And so she sit down, and she's just all calm, and she listening to me pour my heart out and why the family should just go on with their life and blah, blah, blah. And she was like, you finished? I'm like, yeah. And she was like, yeah, so about that not going back into parole, yeah, I've been with you for like 4 years. You taking your ass back in the parole board. And you fighting this one out, right? So 2010 come, I go to parole board, great interview. I'm kind of indifferent, I'm on the fence. I'm not gonna get too excited, not gonna feel too depressed about it. Long story short, they parole me. June 22nd, 2010, one day after my 38th birthday, I walked out of prison a free man. I spent 19 years inside, so in essence, half of my life was in prison, half of my life out. And on the way out the door, here's what they told me. They said, it's great that you're all excited, but you'll probably be back in about 6 months because your kind don't make it. Long-term prison, you've been gone for 2 decades, it's a different world out there. Convicted of murder, nobody's gonna hire you. You're an OG, you're gonna be easily right back in the streets. I said, well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the exciting endorsement on the way out. But here's what I did. So I walked out of prison, and I believe that it wasn't until I walked out that I began to repay my debt to society. And here's why. For the 19 years I was in prison, I was in prisons way up north, out in these rural spaces that had nothing to do with the community I came from. So I walked out and I began to mentor immediately. The first week I was out, I went to a school. and started talking to young men and women, kids who were much like myself. And so I started doing that work, and I began to develop programs for schools. And it was so crazy because I would have to fight my way into these schools because they have policies that basically preclude people who have felonies from going in schools. And it's sad and it's tragic because nobody can speak to them kids like us. Can't nobody relate to their reality like us. And so I fought my way through that, and I began to do the work. And there was this program that came out called Be Me, Black Male Engagement Challenge. And people nominated me for this program. I'm like, I don't care about all this. They like, no, we nominated you. We think you're doing amazing work, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm like, okay, cool, whatever. And I ended up becoming one of the finalists. And I was like, wow, this is getting kind of interesting and intriguing. And long story short, I ended up winning the Black Male Engagement Leadership Award for the work that I was doing in the community. I had been out of prison 1 year. I went from winning that award to getting a fellowship at MIT Media Lab, one of the most prestigious colleges in the world. I got a fellowship there. I started a project called the Atonement Project, which was nominated for a TED Prize. It's a $1 million prize globally. I was one of 20 finalists. I took that opportunity and went to the University of Michigan and said, you know what, I want to teach a class here. I don't have a PhD, a BA, an MBA, an MBA, CBS, HBO. Got none of this shit. I got nothing but a heart. That's all I got, right? And they said, you know what? We think you should be teaching here. So I taught at the University of Michigan for 3 semesters. But they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. I went on to get a fellowship at Kellogg, which I'm wrapping up my 3rd year of that fellowship right now. They said I'd be back in 6 months. I did a talk at TED's 30th anniversary, biggest platform you could be on as a speaker. I was named one of the top talks of 2014. That talk currently has over 1.3 million views. 2015, I had this little conversation in Santa Barbara, cute little rose garden house with Oprah Winfrey. She wrote about that interview. She said it was not only one of the best in her career, it's one of the best in her life. And then she texted me, and she said, out of 37,500 interviews I've done, yours is in the top 5. I said, yeah, okay, that's cool. Straight. All right, then, oh. But then I thought about it. I said, wow, she's interviewed some people. She interviewed Michael Jackson, President Obama, J. Bay, Michelle Obama, Mandela, Maya Angelou. I'm like, wow, one of them had to get out my spot. Top 5. Top 5 dead or alive. So that happened. And then shortly after that, we re-released Righting My Wrongs, signed a major book deal to redistribute and re-release that book. Debut on the New York Times bestseller list. New York Times bestseller. Even though they said 6 months after I was released, I would be back in prison. One of the interviews I had recently, they asked me, are you shocked? Were you shocked when you landed on the New York Times bestseller list? Were you shocked at what Oprah said about you? And I said, no. They was like, what? What you mean, like you're not shocked that Oprah said these great things about you? I said, no. And they was like, why not? I said, because here's what I believe. I believe that if you're going to do something in life, aspire to be the best at it. Aspire for greatness. Like, why settle for mediocrity when greatness is available? And so I don't settle. When I sit down to do something, I want to be the best at it, period. I didn't want to be known as, oh, he's a good writer to come out of prison. No, I want to be known as one of the best writers in the history of writing, period. We owe that to ourselves. It's not a person in here, in this room right now, that's here by happenstance. Your birth and your presence here is very intentional. It's divinely ordered. Like, you can't ignore the divine nature of your being. And when you play small, that's offensive to the divine nature of who you are. And so you have to show up in the world with that understanding of who you are. Just recently, I won the NAACP Image Award, the Ford Men of Courage Award, and then like last week, I was announced as one of Oprah's Super Soul 100 leaders that work in various spaces throughout the world. I've been home 6 years. I wrote down my goals when I started writing a journal. This is why I think it's so important to write journals. Is when you write in your journal becomes your navigation system. It lets you know, are you on course or do you need to be rerouted? And so I was very intentional about what I wanted to happen as a result of the work that I do. And so I just wrote down, hey, New York Times bestseller, if you're going to be a writer, why not be the best? If you're going to be interviewed by anybody about writing, why not be interviewed by the best? It just seemed like the logical thing to aspire toward. And so I share all that to say this, and I'll close with these thoughts. Inside of prison right now is so much untapped genius. It's so many men and women inside who have all these different skill sets that can change the environment and change the world that we live in. The thing is, we have to think of them as being worthy of a second chance. It's not a person in this room, young or old, who hasn't made a poor decision, who hasn't said something mean, who may have even done something mean. Nobody wants to be held hostage to that one moment for the rest of their life. What I found is that oftentimes how we see ourselves is based on other people's interpretation and based on how other people assess us. And especially with everything that's going on in the community, in the world right now. A lot of that is based on narrative. What is the narrative that you're telling yourself when you see a black man? When an officer pulls a black man over, what is the narrative running through his head that dictates how he reacts to him compared to when he see a white man? It's a very different narrative. So these stories that we tell ourselves have power. And we're talking about changing the world and changing how you see people. Those words have power. I'm going to close with this last story. I'm going to keep it really brief. When I was at MIT Media Lab, we were talking about innovation. I started learning all this new language. See, when I walked out of prison, I came out to a very different world. Like, there was no internet when I went to prison. Think about that. No smartphones, no laptops, none of this slick technology that we see. So it was almost like Fred Flintstone walking into an episode of The Jetsons. I'm like, you can talk to people on the phone, you can see their face and Skype and FaceTime. I'm like, this is wild out here, cars talking. And I first got in the car that talked, though, I was like, oh, hey. I don't know if y'all my car talk now, so you know, I stepped my game up a little bit since I've been out. But when I was sitting there, I was thinking about this, I was like, I'm watching how they work at MIT Media Lab. They in there breaking stuff, they taking stuff apart. And I'm like, hey, we did that at the crib. They'd be like, why is you tearing stuff up? They call it deconstructing. Reverse engineering. Oh, that's what you call that when you break something, reverse engineering? And so I say, bam, I got an idea. I said, I'm going to do a prison hack at MIT Media Lab. So I'm going to get them 5 design challenges, 5 things that we use to survive in prison, and I'm going to get them the same materials, and I'm going to see if they can make it. So one of the design challenges was to create a tattoo gun out of a tape player motor, an ink pen, and a guitar string. One challenge was to create a lighter out of batteries. So batteries and a piece of wire make a lighter. One challenge was to make what's called a stinger, which is a thing that you plug in to heat your water up, and it's made out of extension cord and nail clippers. And then one was like to make a tape player. And I don't know if y'all know what tape players are, but they just little things that music used to play through back in our day. Some of y'all might still got them in y'all car. Y'all need to get yourself together. Get it together now. Put them flip phones up and get y'all the real phone. So, and then the other was to make a fish line, right? So we gave them about 2 hours. And literally, they did not complete not one of the design challenges. In fact, we blew the power out of MIT Media Lab. I was like, yes. Because what that proved to me is that innovation, genius, and intelligence is oftentimes dictated by who's the person telling the story. See, in prison, when you make a tattoo gun, you're breaking the rules. When you make a tattoo gun out of a tape player motor, an ink pen, and a guitar string, you're a rule breaker, you're a troublemaker. Now, had they made that at MIT Media Lab, that'd have been a news story. Like, this is so genius, they just made a tape player into a tattoo gun. And so it proved the point that we have to tell our own stories. And we have to start taking control of the narratives as it relates to who we are, what our capabilities are, what our potential is. And we have to share that with the young people that we're responsible for mentoring and raising up. But more importantly, you got to tell yourself your own narrative every day. Because inherently, we're all geniuses of something. And we just have to decide what that is. Salute y'all. Thanks. Yeah, we have a really interesting relationship. So 17 years into my sentence, my girlfriend at the time brought my mother to see me. That was the first time I saw my mother in 17 years. And I remember going in and thinking to myself that it's so important for me to forgive her, to move on with my life. And so that's what I did. And then I got out, she talked about, I want to be there as a mother and blah, blah, blah. And then that didn't happen. And I found myself resenting her. And then I got out of prison and, we reconnected and we hang out and we talk or whatever. And it wasn't until I was having a conversation with my brother about forgiveness that I realized that I really had conditionally forgave her. So I had forgave her with the expectation that she would become a different person than who she is. And in reality, she's just not, and it's okay. And so I had to find peace within myself to say, you know what? This is my mother. This is what it is. It's not going to be, the loving mother and son relationship, and that's perfectly fine. Still the woman who gave birth to me. We still cool when we kick it. I just have no expectations that she could be anything other than who she is. And so that's what forgiveness is recognizing that you're giving people the grace that comes with forgiveness, but you're doing it without strings attached to it. So, yeah. Now, I'll take yours. Okay, yeah, definitely, yep.
With the problems facing young African-American males in urban America, what do you think the solution would be for addressing the violence in areas like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Los Angeles, New York? How would you go about tackling those issues?
So this question was, with the violence in cities like Chicago, New York, Cleveland, Detroit, what would I go about tackling them? So I excuse me. I personally don't believe that there's like one solution, right? Gun advocates say, people who are opposed to guns say, we should just take all the guns away and that'll solve the problem. No, because people didn't just start beating each other upside the head with sticks and stabbing each other. We'll figure out ways. I was in prison, so I saw it happen, right? So I think it's a multi-pronged attack that we have to have. For one, you have to find mentors who have real lived experience to give them access to the young men and women. But we also have to address some systemic issues, for one. First of all, our communities are over-policed. We're over-legislated. So a lot of stuff that appears to be criminal really is stuff that shouldn't be dealt with in that manner in the first place. Is what it does. It boxes people out of opportunities. You can't find employment once you have that felony on your record. So those are some of the systemic issues we can deal with. Structurally, you look at the school system, it's completely in shambles. In most of those cities that you just named, in the areas where violence are occurring, there's a consistent theme in terms of the quality of the schools. I was shocked that I walked out of prison that was in better condition than the schools I was going into. That speaks volumes about our investments. We've invested more in prison than we have in education. And so I think that's one of the models that's really important. But having those mentors, having quality educational outlets, having alternative educational outlets, because people learn differently. And that old standardized testing, that don't guarantee you no employment. Most people who got degrees ain't even working in the field that they got a degree in. You know what I'm saying? So we just have to think about different ways to approach those things. I believe in meditation. Meditative practices in the school I think would be really important. Get kids off to a healthy start We don't do that. We talk at kids so much that they begin to shut down. And I watched as I observe it as a mentor walking into school, is what typically happens when a child walks into school, they're like verbally assaulted out the gate. Pull your pants up, take your earbuds off, turn your head around, shut up, you talk too much, you're too quiet, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that's traumatizing. Like to walk into an educational environment to go through that and then be like, okay, yeah, now go in here and take this test. And I always ask the teacher, I say, well, what would happen if you walked into work? And your boss was like, you know what, your suit sucked, your hairdo whack, I'm tired of you sashaying around here, like get it together. Go back out and start over. Like your work day would be, you'd be all on Facebook like, I need to leave, I can't wait till 5 o'clock comes. I'm out of here, I'm tired, they tripping here, right? And so what I found is that when you lift children's self-esteem up, they'll pull their pants up on their own. You know, when you lift them up, all the things that we criticize them for, which we forget that we did, a lot of times they will self-correct. You just have to be committed to listening to them, you know? And so I think that having a multi-pronged attack is really, really important, using all the things we have at our, disposal. And so I'll take one more, and then I'll take yours too, Mike.
As you reflect back in your darkest moment, which sounds like it was in solitary confinement, and you look at that period now, having moved through it and where you are, how do you attribute that in terms of the transformative experience that you went through before and after?
Yeah, I think. So his question is, how do I look at the transformative experience based on my darkest moment? I think our dark moments allow us to really appreciate the light. And some days, even when I'm writing, I'm telling my story, like I can't even fathom being in solitary confinement at this point for 23 hours, locked down a day for 4 years. And I think part of being in that darkness allows you to survive. It's a survival mechanism where you just kind of stop thinking about other things, but it plays a major role in how I see life, how I appreciate life. I appreciate the nuance, the small things of life, but it also fuels my passion to ensure that other young men and women never have to suffer through that. So thank you for that question. I'll take this last one from Mike.
So I got a two-part question. Part one, what role does God play in your life and in your success and in your turnaround? And secondly, you dedicate or thank this woman here named Ebony. So who is Ebony?
Okay, so first question. First question is, I'm a very spiritual person. I'm not a religious person. I studied theology for a long, long time in prison, and I concluded that for me, what works for me is being able to drink from the well of wisdom that comes from all the major religions and those in between. So I'm a studier and practitioner of meditation and mindfulness. Mindfulness means being very present in every moment, acknowledging the humanity and all that you come in contact with, recognizing that spiritually we're interconnected and nothing happens by happenstance, that there's a divine order to the universe. The reason that I don't subscribe to religion is because I just believe that it's just our interpretation of everything that I just said. And whatever works for a person is perfectly fine with me, but spiritually I'm really grounded in the idea of us being able to connect as spiritual human beings living a human existence, and that's how I tend to live my life. And so Ebony, second part, Ebony she's actually the mother of my child. She was my girlfriend for 4 years while I was in prison. 4 years or so when I got out. We broke up about 1.5 years ago. She's one of the most amazing, thoughtful, beautiful women that I know. She's my best friend, and she is like the dopest co-parent ever. So she's an amazing woman. She's a significant part of my journey. I always honor her in everything that I do. I always represent her in the highest light because she's worthy of that. And not just because she was there for me in prison. Like I met her in a joint, which was like crazy. So she's super smart. And when you go look up my picture, you'd be like, she's super fine too, right? So she's a doctor. She got a PhD in developmental psychology. When I met her, it was through my work in prison. I was actually doing mentoring work in prison. She came inside, we met. A year later, we exchanged correspondence. I put that Mac down, like, yo, she was right, because no, seriously though, she was writing me all cool, like, I know you was cool, brother, you might need some, body to correspond. I say, listen, sister, let me just tell you this, right? Like, I'm really feeling you, and, I'm just beyond this pen pal. Let's talk about this for real, right? So that's how our journey began. We connected, but I don't say all those things about her just because we connected in there, but who she is as a person, the work that she's done in the community. She's the co-founder of one of the largest urban farms in Detroit. Actually, it's probably one of the largest in the nation. They got like 10 acres there. She's one of the co-founders of that. Done amazing work in criminal justice reform. She currently works for me, which is a little bit interesting. But then I'm like her supervisor. But it's all, she's still the boss though. But yeah, she's just an amazing sister, you know. So thank you for asking that question, because I think we do need to ensure that we're always lifting our sisters up in the highest light. And she's one definitely worthy of that.
Thank you for watching our Empower Series YouTube video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Remember to hit the subscribe button below, as well as the little button to be notified the next time we upload our video. Until then, stay connected with us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever your social media flavor is. Inspire the world to thrive. See you soon.